This was bound to happen, and now here we are. Earlier today, an F-15 flying over the region of Iran adjacent to Karg Island crashed. The Iranian government claims that it was shot down. The crew of two both ejected. American search and rescue teams quickly recovered one of them. At the time of writing, and bear in mind that this is a rapidly evolving news story, the other one remains missing. Now, because the situation is likely to change again by the time that you watch this, what I want to do today is discuss the more general problem at hand. Maybe Iran will capture the aviator, and we will be living in a situation that I'm about to describe. Or maybe the United States will recover the aviator. But as time passes, and the war persists, assuming that it continues for more than 2 or 3 weeks, we will eventually find ourselves back in this position. And that raises the question of how to think about the situation, whether it is happening now or later. In particular, I want to cover the post-Cold War I history of combat shootdowns of fixed-wing aircraft, to hammer home the point about the inevitability of the situation. Then we will explore the political consequences of Iran capturing a downed aviator. Afterward, we will turn to how this might change US battle plans, with an eye toward the bigger picture involving China. But let's start with the recurring aviation problem. And to be clear, the problem here is something that would make every other country's military jealous. The United States can dominate the skies like no one else. But that does not make Uncle Sam invincible, and that may be one of the key lessons for today. 1991's Operation Desert Storm is a testament to this, though it happened as the United States was transitioning to being a high-tech modern master of the air. Saddam Hussein's forces downed just under 30 fixed-wing aircraft during the war, the plurality of which were A-10 Warthogs. They are a lovable aircraft, and we will be talking about them a bunch later. In any case, these feel different from the current situation because Iraq also took a handful of POWs from more ordinary combat situations. Rather, the best comparison to today is from the Bosnian War, where Scott O'Grady hid behind enemy lines for 6 days before US search and rescue operations located and extracted him. Add F-16s to the list of aircraft that are not invincible. In Kosovo, 2 more targets were shot down. One of these was an F-117 Nighthawk, notably a stealth aircraft. The other was piloted by David Goldfein, who would later become the US Air Force Chief of Staff under Obama. Trying to get closer to the present, the current situation may feel strange due to a lack of such shootdowns during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. On Saddam's half, another A-10 Warthog was the target on April 8, 2003. The Taliban, meanwhile, claimed various strikes, but none were confirmed. If we restrict attention to the current war, you might recall that overeager Kuwaiti defenders brought down 3 F-15s on March 2nd. But those were friendly fire incidents, and thus there was no risk of US pilots falling behind enemy lines. In terms of enemy strikes, there are various reports of Iran having struck MQ-9 Reapers, but those are unmanned and thus still carry no risk. Where things become serious was on March 9th, when Iran hit an F-35. The difference between that and today is that the pilot was able to guide the damaged F-35 back to a friendly base. I am raising this point because, again, domination does not mean invincibility. I am sure that you have already heard claims that this strike demonstrates that the United States has lost control of the skies. If that is true now, then it was true back on March 9th. Control over the skies should not be determined by whether a pilot survives or not. In other words, we should pay attention to process, not outcome. I know that it is a super captivating media story when an aviator's life is on the line, and thus internet commentary on the subject will surge. But that is not the right way to look at the situation. Consequently, I would describe the current situation as worse than the general public may have been thinking about it 24 hours ago, but roughly the same on the more analytical side, because that risk was already understood. just to reinforce the idea that the United States is not too worried about further Iranian interceptors. The search and rescue helicopter teams are getting mid-air refueling directly over Iranian territory, free for average Iranians to film it. Obviously, there is a pressing need to find the missing aviator, and it seems that they were on the receiving end of small arms fire in trying to find the missing aviator. But that is not something that you do if you believe that the other side is about to lob another rocket at you. Lost in the shuffle of the firestorm over the F-15 incident, Iran also downed a Warthog near the Strait of Hormuz. This did not become as big of a news story because, like the F-35 case before it, the pilot navigated the Warthog to safe ground before ejecting. The plane may be old, but it is durable, and that durability may have saved this from becoming a much larger story. As it stands, until Iran can sustain this rate of shootdowns, we are still going to be seeing the United States executing bombing runs over Iran, because the apparent threat level is not high enough to justify pulling those aircraft. However, hold tight for a few minutes, and we will discuss some potential adjustments. As a closing thought on the military risk situation, if there is any concern here, it should be that the situation does not seem to be getting any better. An aerial campaign is predicated on attriting the opposing side, so that it gets progressively weaker over time. Today, we received a couple of data points in a much larger environment, but the lingering Iranian surface-to-air capacity should raise questions in the Pentagon about the war's trajectory. And we will have to revisit this more heavily in, say, a week, if there are a couple more downings to add to the list. The bigger concern is the political fallout from what happens when a pilot lands behind enemy lines. This could go a couple of different ways, neither of which is good. The deceased pilot's body is dragged through the streets, or the surviving pilot becomes a prisoner of war. Either way, images proliferate across social media, and the optics are horrible for the United States. If we can rewind to literally day one of the war, I said, if this campaign lasts for a long time, inevitably an American will die. Will that cause the public, which is perhaps confused why we are there in the first place, to lash out against the war? Bringing back Clinton for a second, he knows the consequence of fatalities in a war with an unclear benefit. And while the mission in Iran is clearer than the Black Hawk Down in the Battle of Mogadishu, this should still raise some concerns inside of the White House. Yes, my earlier list of fixed-wing aircraft incidents left out the most concerning parallel from Somalia, because it is not just fatalities that matter. We have already seen more than a dozen of those. We have images of their flag-draped caskets returning home, and none of that moved the needle. A mutilated body for the American public to see? That might be a different story. However, the Washington of 2026 is different from the Washington of 1993. We are far, far more politically polarized. Democratic approval for the war cannot change much in response to a Black Hawk Down situation today, because it is already close to zero. Independents are more likely to move. But the biggest question for me is whether you will see wholesale abandonment of Trump by Republicans. Certainly, he has already lost the cohort of America First isolationists by just dipping his foot in Iran. Where the rest of the MAGA movement draws the line remains unclear. Switching gears, let's discuss some of the military implications for the United States. Airstrikes will continue in the wake of the F-15 shootdown. There may be a renewed emphasis on searching for Iranian anti-aircraft systems, though. That would delay further strikes on what the Pentagon views as the more valuable targets. As a reminder, the first order effect of anything like this is for the United States to lower its demands at the bargaining table, but for Iran to fully offset that effect by raising its demands by an equal amount. How a slower war plan affects bargaining frictions is the more important question, and the answer will vary depending on what you think is underlying the war. I can see this being bad news, especially if you are in Europe and just want the Strait of Hormuz to reopen. If this is a window of opportunity situation, and the Pentagon's plan is to just go through a laundry list of targets that US intelligence thinks are critical to empowering Iranian protests, then the net effect is a longer war. The United States will continue until that checklist is complete, and the extra caution merely prolongs the process. But let's discuss what more drastic options look like in case the situation gets worse, either politically from a Black Hawk Down crisis, or militarily from more fighters getting shot down without endangering the pilots. We could be seeing the first part of this if, for instance, Iran has developed a new strategy for striking US fighters, and today's targets are the first round of that larger strategy. Well, the first step is to increase Tomahawk launches. Remember, the United States burned through hundreds of Tomahawks over the first few days of the war because they are safe. You fire them from far out at sea, and there is no American life hovering over the skies at risk. That softens the enemy in preparation for the greater aerial operations, like what we have seen afterward. Reapers do what they can in the meantime. Thus, option 1 is to regress back to the start, but that would involve further depleting Tomahawk stockpiles. You can imagine someone at the Pentagon finally tells Trump that enough is enough. The United States cannot continue this process without mortgaging the situation in the Indo-Pacific. It is time to leave Iran and return to the status quo ex ante. Others in the political sphere might also remind the president that he can always say that he destroyed what he wanted to destroy in terms of Iranian stockpiles, in case Trump is worried about the optics of the situation. Because, to some degree, that is true. Some of that stuff did get destroyed. And perhaps that group can take solace in how, despite today's setbacks, the United States has controlled the Iranian skies for more than a month, despite some Chinese platforms intended to boost Iran's defenses. Just in case anyone gets any ideas about invading Taiwan. And a reminder that there, the roles are reversed, where the PRC would have to figure out a way to get their fighters off the ground to change the status quo. Returning to Iran, a less drastic revision in strategy might be to cut back on Warthog missions along the Iranian coast. Again, they are durable aircraft, but they lack defenses against anti-aircraft missiles, so strafing runs along the coast might seem more dangerous. Maybe that is what happened today. The trick here is that while Warthogs are not as valuable as modern fighters, the propaganda value of getting the pilot is more important for Iran. In better news for the United States, they could continue thinning out Shahed drones directly over the Gulf, where distance can act as the Warthog's shield. A medium option is to reconsider which fighters fly over Iran. To further drive home the point that the United States was well aware that an F-15 could be struck, note that the F-15 is not a stealth aircraft. The F-35, however, is. If Iran could strike a stealth aircraft a few weeks ago, then certainly Iran would have an easier time striking a non-stealth aircraft. The only reason that CENTCOM employs the F-15 is that they can deliver substantially larger payloads. So a half measure would be to temporarily pull the F-15s, do some more target softening, and then get back to the full program. Okay, with that, what are our takeaway lines for today? Regardless of how today's crisis ultimately unfolds, Iran taking living or deceased bodies of U.S. service personnel is a political liability for the Trump administration, with just how bad being a bit ambiguous. The United States will only make minor modifications to the battle plan in light of the incident until Iran demonstrates that it has this capacity more regularly. And the options that the United States has to scale back to a safer operational strategy are not good. What is good is that we are entering the weekend, and I leave you with a photo that at least some of you appear in. That's right, Lines on Maps spares no expense to ensure a happy audience. Meanwhile, you can make me happy by having enjoyed this video. And if you did, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.